We're talking about the book of Ecclesiastes this morning, and there are three books that are tied to the life of Solomon. There's the Song of Songs and the Song of Solomon, depending on what Bible you read or what tradition you come from. And I don't know how to say this in the most... it's Solomon at his most, let's say, passionate, right? He's young, he's romantic. It's a book that expresses all of those feelings as a young person. Then there's the book of Proverbs, which Pastor Steve preaches on next week, or preached on last week. And Proverbs represents Solomon at the height of his power and his authority and his influence. Solomon is the wisest man in the world. He's the richest man in the world. He's the most influential man in the world. And Solomon contributes this book. There's other writers there, but the idea here is that it's Solomon at the height of his power and his influence, telling you and me how to live our life. The idea is he knows how to do it better than us, so we'd better sit down, shut up, and listen. It's a radically different perspective. Song of Solomon is romantic and poetic and flowing and excited. It really feels like it's a work of youth. The book of Proverbs has the weight and the gravitas of somebody who knows what they're saying is right and knows what they're writing is timeless and wants everybody else to hear them because they have the strength and the wisdom to say, and we should listen. Ecclesiastes is the third book of this triad that is connected to Solomon, and it has a very different outlook. Ecclesiastes is sort of connected to Solomon at the end of his life. It has if you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it has a bit of a bitterness to it, almost sarcastic at moments. It's almost tinged with anger and frustration at times, and we'll pick on that today. It's wildly different again. Song of Songs, he's young and he's romantic. At Proverbs, he's strong and he's commanding. And at the end of his life, Solomon has this sort of sense of bitterness. And the overarching element here that we're going to talk about, and this what you catch when you read Ecclesiastes, is Solomon is really, even though he's the wisest man in the world, there's a sense in which the book takes this idea of don't do what I did. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody like that? A mentor in your career, or a parent, or a grandparent? They sit you down and they recount to you their mistakes. Their hope is that you learn from their mistakes so that you don't make the same stupid decisions they did. That's Solomon here. And the idea here is that at this passage, what I just read, and what I'll read again here in a minute, is he sets up this dichotomy between what it's like to be old and what it's like to be young. And the idea here, and the first thing I want to talk about this morning as we sort of get into that, is this: remember God in the good times. The overarching perspective, and again, we're going to move past this, so if you're offended that I talk about how bad it is to be old when I'm 35, please just walk with me a minute and don't get offended. Okay? The idea, the dichotomy that Solomon is setting up here is that when you're old, times are not quite as good, and when you're young, times are great. He begins by saying, don't let the excitement of youth cause you to forget your Creator. The idea here, the underlying assumption here is that Solomon is an old man who's reflecting back on what it's like to be young, and he realizes that in many ways, being young is the exact opposite of being old. And there's this long poetic phrase that I read from verses 1 through 7 that sort of describes, this is a perfect example of Hebrew poetry. When we think poetry, we think Shakespeare and rhyme and meter and all of these things. Hebrew poetry is one of the core ideas of Hebrew poetry, and this will help you as we're in our reading this year getting into the prophets, which are primarily poems, is this. Hebrew poetry is about saying the same thing in 50 different ways. The idea here is he wants us to see a principle through a sort of kaleidoscope. You know what I mean? Where you spin it and the colors shift and you see the same thing in a myriad of different ways. What he is trying to do is to describe to us, the young person, what it will be like when we are old. Remember, these are Solomon's words, not mine. Honor him in your youth before you grow old and say, and so this is 1,000 different ways that you say and express and feel as an old person. Life is not pleasant anymore. And then he begins to describe how it's not pleasant. The light of the sun, moon, and stars dim your old eyes. When you're old, your eyes are dim. When you're young, your eyes are bright and you can see really, really well. When you're old, your eyes are dim and it's hard to see. Remember him before your legs, the guards of your house, starts to tremble. Weakness. Have you ever ran a long time or walked a long time and your legs are trembling because you're really, really tired? The older you get, the quicker that happens. Remember him before your legs start to tremble. Your shoulders, the strong men, stoop under the weight of life. Remember him before your teeth. Your few remaining servants stop grinding before your eyes. The women looking through the windows see dimly, right? The idea here is your legs get weak when you're older. Your shoulders get weak when you're older. You lose your teeth. When you're young, your legs are strong. You can run for miles. You can carry heavy loads. But as you get older, you can't run, you can't carry, and your teeth begin to fall out. Somebody identifies really well with this passage. Remember him before the door to life's opportunities is closed. When you're young, you have the world in front of you, don't you? I can do what I want. What do we ask kids? What do you want to be when you grow up? Because you can do anything. My 3-year-old is convinced he's going to be a superhero. He wants to be Spider-Man. So we've got to get him a pet spider and see if that works. Right? The older you get, the less opportunities you have. Steve has talked about this. He's talked about this to me privately, but he's also talked about this from the pulpit. That is, right? The older you get, the less room you have to recover from mistakes. When you're young, you can be dumb and you can take time to recover. Remember him before the sound of work fades. When you're young, you can put in extra hours, work extra long, double down, and outwork your problems. But when you're old, you don't have that capacity anymore. Now you rise to the first chirping of the birds. When you're young, you rise and you get up. Although I think it's when you're older, you get up earlier, unless you're a young kid. But now you rise up and you're ready to go. There, the sounds will become faint. Remember him before you become fearful of falling. I have an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old. Falling is an Olympic sport to them. There's 4 people who live in my house. 2 of them stand on the back of the couch. And their favorite game is to have me lift them up and throw them like a sack of potatoes over the back of our sectional to land and roll off. And the higher I throw them and the farther I throw them, the better it is. You best bet I would never let somebody do that to me. My kids, he says, before you worry about the danger in the streets. My kids go out, they don't know about anything. Right? They don't care. They're not aware of the dangers of the world. I am. Before your hair turns white like an almond. And this is my favorite metaphor. Before you drag along without energy like a dying grasshopper. That is Hebrew poetry at its finest. Right? That just like, I don't even know how to mime this, but imagine you're dragging yourself through life and the bottom half of your body is just sort of dead and you're just sort of like going along like a zombie, right? Like you just can barely move. You're slow, you're tired. That's the idea. And then there's something about the caper berry inspiring sexual desire, and I'm not going to talk about that because my parents are in the room. The idea here is it's setting up this grand dichotomy between what it's like to be old and what it's like to be young. When you're young, you think none of these things are going to happen to you. And when you're old, all of these things happen to you. Now, before anybody's offended that I talk about how bad it is to be old, I want to come to an idea here. That the idea that Solomon is trying to get at is this. When the young people tend to forget who God is and the role he ought to play in their life because they haven't experienced any of these things that the older Solomon has. They're convinced They're obsessed with the things they want to accomplish in life. The degrees or the jobs, the titles they want to attain, the homes they want to buy, right? When you're young, you want to buy a bigger house. When you're old, you get tired of cleaning the bigger house and you just want a smaller house. Right? When you're young, you want a bigger car. When you're old, you want a smaller car because you're tired of paying $100 to turn your car on every time. You're convinced that you have endless opportunities. They put a great deal of faith and trust in their own personal abilities. I can work harder and go farther and do more. When you're young, you're not afraid to fail and try new things. When you're young, you are convinced that you have an unlimited amount of time. You can always put off important things till tomorrow. And when you're young, that's what you do. Practically, you don't invest when you're young because you want to spend money, right? You don't form the right relationships when you're young. You tend to sort of just do those sort of things. So there's this dichotomy, and the tension here, the irony here is when you are young, you have the capability of doing all kinds of things, but you don't have the wisdom to know what to do. Endless opportunities, but you don't have the wisdom to know which one is right. And as you get older, you get the opposite problem. You finally have the wisdom to know what to do, but your opportunities to do that have become more and more diminished the older you get. So Solomon, that's the idea here that Solomon is trying to lay out, but it's not merely about being old and being young. I'd like to reframe this because I think Solomon, who is an old man at this point, reflecting over his life and the mistakes that he has made, is using this dichotomy to talk about something that's beyond mere age. And it's this idea of when life is good versus when life is not so good. You see, when life is good and we're young, we're strong, we're running forward, we've got the world in front of us, everything is going right. And whether we're in our 20s, our 30s, our 40s, our 50s, when our career is going well, we want to work and we want to advance, we want to get that title, that corner office, that position, that pay raise, we want to rush forward as fast as we possibly can. We know God is important intellectually, but we tend to say, I'll get right with God, or I will put God as a priority of my life tomorrow. Let me take care of this. Let me make a little bit more money so that my kids have a little bit nicer place to live. Let me do this, and when I get all of this stuff done, then I will get right and push in and get serious about my relationship with God. When times are good, therefore, we tell God, I love you and I appreciate you, but let me take the wheel for a little bit. Let me go forward, go faster, get these things done because I have things I want to accomplish. You could be along with me, but let me take the wheel. And then, driving along, things start to go sideways, don't they? I wasn't going to tell this story, but I am. When I was 17 years old, my friends and I decided that we wanted to go to my grandparents' house. They lived out in the middle of nowhere, and we were going to set up a fireworks show. So we were young. We were 17. We had money and we had cars, which is a really awful combination, right? You're young, you have time, and you have money. So we went down to Missouri. I lived in Iowa at the time. We went down to Missouri and bought several $100s worth of fireworks. We went to my grandparents' house and lived out in the middle of nowhere. Like you took a highway out to their house, and then you went over this sort of large, steep. This railroad track was set up several feet above the ground, and you went up over this railroad track, and there was this long gravel road. And at the end of this gravel road, it turned to dirt, and there was these big signs, county maintenance ends here, enter at your own risk. And my grandparents lived down that dirt road. We went down there, we started setting off fireworks, and then, I don't know if you know this about teenage boys, but there are times, it doesn't happen often, but there are times when you don't make great decisions. We started having a fireworks show, and we decided that wasn't exciting enough, so then we decided to have a fireworks fight. We started shooting bottle rockets and Roman candles at each other all night. Miraculously, somehow, we got through. We didn't burn anything down, and nobody died. The next morning, we're driving home, and my friend Kyle brought us out in his 91 Honda Civic. We're leaving the house, we go through the dirt road, and we go around, and we hit the gravel, and we take us this big sweeping left-hand turn on the gravel road, and he sees something ahead, and he looks at me, and he begins to giggle. And he takes this manual car, drops it down into second, and all of a sudden I hear the engine rev, just ring, ring, and suddenly we're speeding up, 20, 25, 30, 35, and I'm like, what are you doing, Kyle? Slow down, hold on, hey, stop, up. And by the time I figure out what's happening, we're going 50 miles an hour. We're fishtailing down this gravel road. Behind us, there's this giant plume of gray smoke and dirt as we are speeding down the road. And then I realize what he has seen. Kyle saw that railroad track and realized that it would make the perfect ramp. 50 miles an hour in a Honda Civic, Kyle takes that ramp, and I remember, like it was yesterday, we hit the incline, and the whole car, front and back bumper, just slam off the gravel road, and it jarred us to our bone, and then we took off. You know in the space shuttle, right, the International Space Station where they're just sort of floating around and everything's floating through the air. All of the junk from the floors of his car were floating up in the air. And I was screaming like a little girl. Kyle didn't even look at me, or he didn't even look ahead when we hit that ramp. He was looking at me and giggling. And then he turned his head and looked forward. And in a matter of a millisecond, his giggle turned into a scream. Because Kyle saw what I knew was coming. There, 3 feet in the air, soaring through, doing our best Dukes of Hazzard impression. Kyle sees that 200 feet down the road is a 4-lane highway running perpendicular to this gravel road. And we are soaring through the air, flying. And I hear 3 quick pumps as his foot hits the brakes. And I don't know if you know this, there's a special feature about Honda Civics, and it's this: when the car is in the air, the brakes don't work. He's slamming on the brakes, and here we are just sailing, opera music. It's just this crazy moment. And in the air, we see, in addition to this road, there is this farm truck coming along, right? We hit the ground. The whole car hits with such a thud that it bounces up into the air again and lands again on the ground. Finally, we hit the ground, and he hits the brakes. But we're going so fast, and it's a gravel road, so he's got no traction. Then Kyle, for whatever reason, apparently when you see your death, you might as well turn into it. He just slams the car to the left. The car is coming down the road like this. He turns the car to the left in an attempt to sort of keep us from going into the highway. But all that happens then is we start Tokyo drifting sideways, fishtailing out into the street, out into the highway. The car doesn't turn. We just sort of spin sideways and slide. I can only imagine what this guy thought when he saw us just appear out of nowhere, airborne, over this impromptu ramp. We slide out and just barely, I remember the tires, the right tires of the car, hit the asphalt and finally grabbed something they could grab to purchase on. The car sort of slides to a halt, it kind of leans up and then slams back down. And the farm truck, the poor farm truck, had swerved all the way out of the way, made a very rude gesture to us, probably saying something really mean, and then drove away. And at that moment I realized that it wasn't just Kyle and I screaming. My 14-year-old brother was in the car with us. At that moment, I realized that if we had actually hit the truck, the least of my worries would have been the accident, because I would have had to go home to Mama. See, what happens is when you're young and when times are good, you speed forward because all you see is the thing ahead of you. You want to achieve it, you want to experience it, you want to have it, you want to do it, and you go forward as fast as you possibly can, and you don't give a second thought to the consequences that might be on the other side. And then you start to make a mess of things. The idea here that Solomon is capturing is he wants us in the good times to live as if we live in the bad times. See, the good times, we put God in the background and we do what we want. And when things are not going so well, that's when we press into God, isn't it? Our life starts to flip. Bad things start to happen, and we want God to suddenly take control because we've screwed it up. Solomon here begins this passage by begging us to treat your relationship with God in the good times like you know you'll treat it in the bad times. Don't wait until your life has fallen apart to get serious about placing God at the center point of your life. Don't wait until your life falls apart to prioritize God, because you will only regret it if you do. And Solomon says this from experience. He goes on from this long sort of poetic phrase. And this is the next point. He says, because the things that you chase in the good times don't really matter. After this long sort of poetic phrase, he then sort of interjects with this harsh response. And it says in Ecclesiastes 8, everything is meaningless, says the teacher, completely meaningless. The Hebrew word there, meaningless is an accurate translation, but the literal phrase is one of vapor or steam. The idea here, and it's a word picture. It's a potent word picture. Picture a large pot of boiling water. All right, you're getting ready to throw some pasta in, and the water's roiling. You put your hand in the pot just barely above the water. Within a moment, it'll sear and burn your skin. It's really, really hot, dangerously hot, and there's nothing worse than a steam burn. You take that same pot with the same water and put your hand a foot over the top of the pot. It's warm, but it's not dangerous anymore. You put your hand 2 or 3 feet above that pot, all you get is a faint puff of vapor. Right? The idea here, the word picture is everything in this world amounts to vapor. When you're really, really close to it, it's powerful and strong and compelling and exciting, and we want it so bad. But the minute you get a little bit of distance from it, all of that vanishes. The things that we chase when life is going well disappear. The things that we think are so important when everything is going well, when we get just a little bit of distance from them, we realize that none of them are worth what it costs to attain them. Why does Solomon dash in with this phrase? I told you that the book of Proverbs represents Solomon at the height of his power. 1 Kings chapter 10 and 11 talk about what life was like for Solomon at this moment. It says that Solomon brought in 25 tons of gold per year. In addition to the 25 tons of gold per year, he had an unbelievable amount of taxes coming in from all of the commerce. He had these fleets of trading ships that would go out around the Mediterranean. They'd come back every 3 years loaded down with gold and silver and jewels and animals and all of these things. He's also the wisest man and the wealthiest man, and he's also the most famous man. And so people come from all over the known world, and when they come to have lunch with him, they bring these huge, beautiful, exorbitant gifts. Solomon, who started out when God first came to him and said, "What do you want?" He says, "I just want the wisdom to govern your people, for they're too numerous. Who could do a good job?" At the height of Solomon's power, his whole life becomes this endless black hole of consumption. At the height of his power, it says that silver was meaningless because there was just too much of it lying around. His bowls, his plates, and his silverware were solid gold, not because it made the food better, but because there was nothing else to spend money on. At the height of his power, Solomon had transitioned from this man who was desperate for wisdom so he could just be a good king, to he had so much, and his life became this endless desire, this endless circle of consumption. He began chasing the comma, if you will. Making money when he didn't need money, taxing people in a really heavy manner when he didn't need to tax them, sending out people to make him more money when he didn't need it. And at the height of this power, then he began marrying all of these women. It says that he had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. Now, I don't want to be crass here, but I want to say this. What is it that wife number 700 brings Solomon that 699 don't? What value does 300 concubines add to his life beyond those 700 wives? The answer is nothing. The idea here is these women are not there because they add value or ever. They become another way to consume, to own, and to hoard like everything else in his life. He's pursuing women. He's pursuing wealth. He's pursuing influence. He's pursuing fame. He's pursuing all of these things. And Solomon ends up living a life where the word no does not exist to him. There's not a thing, a person, an experience in this world that he can't buy. And what happens is those women end up derailing him. Solomon, who started out faithful and wanting wisdom and who talked to God twice, those women end up bringing in foreign idolatry back into Israel. Because he marries women from eras and people who God specifically prohibited Israel to marry, the Midianites and the Canaanites. The idea here is Solomon, at the height of his power, thought, I'm too wise, I'm too knowledgeable, I'm too strong. Those rules might apply to other people, but they don't apply to me. I won't be tripped up by them. And those women, the thing that he's chasing, introduce idolatry back into the nation. And this just isn't Solomon's problem, because it's become such a problem. Idolatry becomes sort of the norm in the nation of Israel for the rest of the time. And God says he's going to rip the kingdom from Solomon's descendants. So Solomon's desire to chase whatever he wanted, to chase anything he could get in the world, ended up wrecking not only his own personal relationship with God, but damaging and destroying his descendants' ability to be king, and brought the people of Israel back into a system of idolatry. Solomon is writing this book, or contributing to this book, after these events have happened. Solomon is now looking back on this life that he's lived. And what he knows now is all of that stuff that I spent my best years chasing is meaningless. Can't take my riches. Can't take my wives. Can't take my fame. Can't take my influence. I'm going to lose all of that I've chased when I go into the grave. The problem is Solomon hasn't realized this. He's not learned this lesson until after all of this has happened. And now, because of what he has said before, what we just looked at, Solomon now realizes he has the wisdom to see what he has done, but now because of his decisions, he has no ability to fix the problem that he's created. Because his opportunities to change have been squished and smashed and changed by his decisions. What doors were open, would have been open if he was faithful, have now been closed because he has made decisions unfaithfully. The reason why he dashes off this phrase, everything is meaningless, completely meaningless, is Solomon realizes that he spent the best years of his life chasing things, and now that he is at the end of his life, he realizes that the price he paid to get all of that wasn't worth the cost. He had a life where everything he wanted was his except God. And it's not just Solomon's problem, is it? We do the same thing. We might not have the same worldwide fame and influence and riches, but you'd best believe we do the same thing. God, I know you want me to spend more time in your word, but I've got to work this overtime because we've got this bill to pay. We've got to get this car. We've got to do this. God, I know you want me to be involved more in church, but I've got these other priorities, and I will, when I get all of this stuff taken care of, I promise you. The reality is when our life is going on in the busyness of life, we always give God tomorrow, but we don't give him today. We promise God tomorrow, but we hold today for ourselves. We mean it. We mean it. We believe it. God, tomorrow, when we get this, I will be serious. I will put you first once again, but we never do because there's always something new to chase. Every time you pay off one bill, another one comes. Every time you get one raise, another one is on the horizon. Every time you get the new car or the new house or the new thing, there's something else that you want to get to keep up with your neighbors. God doesn't want your tomorrow. He wants your today. The issue is that we are terrified of giving God control of our life because at our core, we are scared that God will take our own dreams, our own goals and aspirations, and replace them with his. And it's this constant struggle, even as believers, to question who really controls our life. The reason why we don't give God today is because if we give God today, it means he's going to require us to give up some of those things that we desperately want. And so we say tomorrow, let me get what I want today, and then I'll give you the rest tomorrow. But tomorrow never comes. Unfortunately, and this is my last point today, God cares about more than your salvation. Now, I don't mean to downplay the notion of salvation, but here's where I want to sort of land the plane today, if you will. Too often we reduce the work of God in our lives to helping us die better. I just want to know that when I die, I'm going to go to heaven. But God is not only interested in helping you die better, he wants to help you live better, too. God really does care about how you live. He really does want you to give him your life. You see, too often we are more than happy to say, to live in the fact and to embrace and celebrate the fact that God saved us. What we don't give enough credit is the fact that when God saves us, he also owns us. We're happy to give God our death, but we're terrified to give God our life because that really costs us something, doesn't it? It's easy to say, I'll give you my death because I don't have to change how I live. I don't have to have responsibilities. I can do what I want as long as I make it in. I'm good. But God is not content to help you die well. He demands to help you live well. He demands to be at the center of your life. Romans 6:22 says, Paul says this to the Roman church, but now you are free from the power of sin and have become slaves of God. Now you do those things that lead to holiness and result in life. So often, we reduce God's role in our life to this parental figure who sort of just hovers around while we do our best and make a mess of our lives and try better. What I'm asking you to do today is to commit to letting go of your own aspirations and your own dreams and your own goals Because you have to give him control of your life, or you will be the person careening down the road as fast as you can, going in the wrong direction without any clue about what's coming up on the other side. You must choose this day who controls your life. Jesus might have saved you, but that doesn't mean he controls your life. Do you call the shots? Do you set the direction? Do you set the priorities? Do you set the direction? Or does God set the direction?